Hi, everyone, and welcome to the ENS Environmental Podcast. I'm your host, Sonu Mansingh, an associate in the Natural Resources and Environment team in the Santon Johannesburg office. Today, we're diving into a topic that sits at the intersection of environmental policy, business operations, and social impact. South Africa's approach to food loss and waste reduction compared to what we're seeing in the European Union. I'm joined by my colleague, Colin Fratelli Davies, a consultant with 16 years of experience in our natural resources and environment practice, who advises clients on waste and circular economy regulation and strategy. When she's not decoding complex law, Colin is passionate about sustainable fashion, commonly known as Consciously Colin on Instagram. She serves on the board of the Africa Fashion Guild and has published a local guide spotlighting and supporting South African fashion brands. We're also joined by Stefan Burrows, CEO and Head of Growth at Still Good, a web-based application that connects people with discounted surplus food from retailers and cafes. Stefan is a renowned expert in the environmental space with many years of experience in sustainability, working at Sealand and Pick n Pay. Outside of work, Stefan is a well-known surfing enthusiast. Colin, Stefan, great to have you both.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's delve in. When we talk about food loss and waste, we're not just talking about leftovers. We're talking about a material climate issue. Organic waste generates methane in landfills and a social issue in a country where food insecurity remains real. In South Africa, while 13.8 million people face food insecurity, more than 10 million tons of mostly edible food, valued at approximately 61 billion rand, is wasted each year due to inefficiencies across the food supply chain. There are also compliance and operational factors impacting retailers, manufacturers, distributors, and municipalities. Colin, to frame it, if you were briefing a board for the first time, how would you explain the business relevance of a food waste policy in South Africa right now? What's the headline risk and opportunity?
Thank you, Sonam. So there are some typical business impacts like wasted costs, which is the status quo at the moment. Food is disposed of by retailers and consumers rather than selling or consuming it. So I think costs and wasted costs always catch a board's attention. And then from a risk perspective, when legislation is passed to address an issue, it just adds additional administrative costs, not to mention sanctions for non-compliance. So those are the two risks and issues that we commonly face, especially when we move from a generally unregulated to a regulated area of the law. And so from a more appetizing, pun intended, perspective, looking to opportunities, with a shift in focus to environmental social governance, or ESG for short, operational requirements and stakeholders will broaden. So the business will have to look at the community and the environment, not just shareholders and customers. So ensuring less food waste positively impacts the environment by diverting food waste away from our landfills, just as you've mentioned, which do not have much capacity left in any case. So there's also the methane gas that's created by the food waste, which you've also covered. And then finally, when we look at the community will certainly benefit if there's more accessibility to cheaper food, and it also provides a social license for companies to operate. If they're seen to be doing good, then their customers are much more likely to support them.
And Stefan, as previously the head of sustainability at Pick n Pay, you are familiar with the business impacts of food waste. But now through Still Good, you have identified an opportunity to provide affordable food and reduce food waste. Please share more about your experience with food waste and what led to the development of Still Good.
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of time in retail, and the food waste problem became very evident. I think, sustainability issues are often spoken about as a sort of multifaceted, environmental, social, governance, etc. However, I think there's very few categories where they are as multifaceted as food waste. In the context of a developing country, with mass unemployment and food insecurity, food waste, for me personally, is even more of a social issue than it is an environmental issue. It was spoken about methane, et cetera, and food organic waste on landfill is a big source of carbon emissions. However, for me, from an ethical perspective, good food not getting to human beings is a serious issue. Food. The good thing about South Africa is we have a pretty formal retail environment. So sell-by dates are, for the most part, adhered to. We have a pretty formal food supply chain, so there's good food safety standards, et cetera, et cetera. However, when you're dealing with perishable foods, there will always be food waste in a retail environment. Retailers want to have on-shelf availability of above 90%. There's always going to be food waste. I think the status quo in South Africa for a long time has been, landfilling that food that hasn't been sold in time, or donating. I think the issue with both of those sort of models is there's no commercial incentive for the retailer in those circumstances. So with what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a scalable commercial model to reduce food waste, because at the end of the day, in corporate South Africa and in corporates in general, money talks. And I think the big issue with both policy and the sustainability space in general is we haven't got scalable commercial models which provide the right incentives for doing the right thing. And that's what we're trying to do. It's still good.
And on that, moving to the current position in South Africa, nationally, we have this draft strategy for reducing food losses and waste that was published for public comment in September 2023. It sets a clear direction, aligned with the global goal to halve per capita retail and consumer food waste by 2030. Build a circular economy around unavoidable organics, and scale donation and redistribution. But this is still a strategy in draft form, not yet binding law. At the same time, industry has moved ahead with an important food loss and waste voluntary agreement. Anchored by major retailers and manufacturers and launched in 2020, the agreement has created real infrastructure, such as measuring, reporting, hotspot mapping, and knowledge sharing. In practice, this is the national vehicle for action while we wait for binding targets. Colin, can you unpack this draft strategy for us? What are the pillars and goals that matter for operators, and what would become mandatory if the strategy does become law?
Sure, thank you. It is quite a mouthful because, of course, policies and laws are always quite detail orientated. But essentially, the draft strategy for South Africa at this stage, as we've mentioned a few times already, the first aim is to cut food loss and waste across the supply chain. Another thing that's quite important is to shift organics out of landfills, so that's the methane aspect, and then to support food security. And as Steph has said, I think that's almost one of the most important aspects of the strategy. And so we are signatory to a lot of the UN doctrines and policies, and the SDG 12.1 is framed around circular economic approach to first prevent any type of food loss or waste, and then to redistribute to people, then after that maybe animals, and then possibly for composting, and finally as a last resort then we look to landfill disposal. So those are the general sort of strategies that aligns with the SDG 12.3. And then the actual pillars of the strategy that goes into sort of broader or more specific aspects. And so some of the cornerstones for achieving that food loss and that's the short term for it is FLW. I almost want to say flow, but I think saying food loss and waste is a little bit easier. So to achieve that reduction, it's again focusing on the circular economy and food recovery, collaboration and awareness and education, skills development, capacity building, infrastructure development, and sustainable funding. So there is quite a lot, and I think it goes, again, complex, as Steph has already mentioned. And so it goes into community-based programs and also just dealing with retailers and infrastructure. So quite a lot. But if we look more closely at the strategic goals, the implementation plan speaks about creating and enabling an environment for implementation of the food loss waste interventions, simple and clear rules. So simple and clear, again, that goes back to education, and I think we can often make it a lot easier rather than complicating it. But from a legal perspective, we'd obviously look for something like norms and standards. So the strategy focuses on implementing norms and standards to prevent loss at each stage of the value chain. And then there's also a big focus on guidance for selling ugly produce. So I have this struggle constantly with my kids. There's a bruise on the apple or the banana. Now I can't eat it. And so I even struggle with that in educating my kids. And it's a whole reframing of that guidance on how the food is still edible. We get bruises too, but people hopefully don't run away from us. And then there's also a move towards easier permitting for organics treatment. Next up on the implementation plan is around beneficiation and circular economy. So there are a lot of secondary markets for, even if you can't get people to eat these ugly sort of foods and perishables, then there are secondary markets that they can go into and hopefully have some industrial symbiosis into feed. So that's moving more towards animal sort of feed. And then it also speaks about biogas and compost and how perishables can be moved towards that. And then another pillar, as I said, it's quite a mouthful, is looking towards the capacity building, education, and awareness. So from post-harvest handling to the consumer education on date labels, all of that needs to be put out into the public domain, and that's really important. And then finally, another strategic goal is to look at food waste diversion and GHG emissions, that's greenhouse gas emission reduction. So there again, we look more towards the environmental impacts, things like carbon offset pathways for verified diversion, making food redistribution easier, and building in food bank and school nutrition programs that reuse edible surplus. So those are all of the goals that the implementation plan speaks about. And then it also just sort of moves towards the fact that operators can expect clearer, standardized date labeling and donation guidance, but understanding from Steph that is already quite well established. And then there'll also be requirements for permitting for organic treatment, support for secondary markets, and growing pressure to measure and report on the food loss and waste. So at least this creates some revenue options. So not just looking towards donation, but it can also look towards reducing long-term landfill risk as policy tilts towards more of a diversion, which in any case, our waste management legislation already does set out quite a clear path towards this, just diverting from landfills rather than sending everything there, because as I mentioned, capacity is already a problem. And then to answer your next question, so as I said, that is quite a mouthful, but relating to what is likely to reach regulations, I think as the implementation plan and the policy matures and develops, it's likely that we'll see phased limits or bans on sending organic waste to landfill, which I think is great. And as mentioned, it should go to composting facilities in any case. There's likely to be some mandatory measurement for food loss and waste if that isn't already in place. I think quite a few retailers are likely to have that already. And then reporting on national systems, national norms, liability protection for food donors might come up as well. And then just some more sort of details, I think, going into sort of retail obligations and standards. So as you mentioned, there is the voluntary agreement, but I think just making those more firm in a type of standard, as well as standards for things like for composting. There were some draft composting waste regulations, but those haven't been finalized. So that's a great example of something that could be finalized and implemented. And then, yeah, so for operators, I think just to prepare for all of this, they can start measuring their food loss and waste and plan for mechanisms to reduce organic waste to landfill. And then get compliance basics such as labeling, health and safety, and permits in order if they aren't doing that already, which I'd be very surprised if they aren't. Thanks. That's all for me.
Thanks, Colin. The draft strategy certainly sets out a detailed plan that extends throughout the supply chain and touches on various environmental and social issues. Stefan, has the voluntary agreement shifted industry behavior at all?
In the corporate environment, definitely. In my time at Pick and Pay, we were signatories to the WRI's 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, and broadly the commitment to halve food loss and waste by 2030. Pick and Pay has made good strides in that, from procurement to sort of diverting food waste from landfill, etc., etc. And listen, it has on a corporate level, it has worked. I think it's important to note that about 40% of South Africa's, 30 to 40% of South Africa's retail environment is independent. So these are single store owners, or these are groups of stores under a franchise brand. And if I'm honest with you, there's been no movement there, right? There's been recommendations from corporates, but on the independent level, there's been very little movement. So yeah, I mean, listen, these global initiatives and policy does work, but I think it goes back to incentive, and I think it all comes back to money at the end of the day. Donations work, and donations do serve as a great way to reduce food waste, to divert food waste from landfill, and to help the poorest members of our society. But I don't think there's the adequate incentives behind that to drive any meaningful change at scale.
That's an interesting discrepancy to note between the corporate and the independent supermarkets. Colin, do you see the voluntary agreement as laying the groundwork for future statutory reporting and targets?
I think so. It should definitely give a good basis. And what I find often is that when you have a voluntary program that is implemented and the parties move and adapt and find ways to make it work, that's far better than creating legislation first. That's perfect on paper, but then as soon as you implement it, you see a lot of issues and problems in the implementation. So I think doing it that way round is definitely better. So focusing on the practical application of food waste reduction, while accumulating some data from that voluntary agreement is a really good way to do it. And then from that, you can almost make your regulations and your actual reporting targets, once it's actual legislation, a lot better and sort of foolproof or test proof. So I think that's a great way to do it, and we're likely to see it used as the basis for future legislation.
One place where we do see binding targets in force already is the Western Cape, which has introduced enforceable restrictions on landfilling organic waste and a full prohibition by 2027 via license conditions. These measures will constrain landfill reliance. They will also catalyze composting and other beneficiation capacities and shift existing cost structures. Stefan, what do these new rules mean for businesses operating in the Western Cape? Does this create different compliance targets across the provinces? And how are companies closing that gap, if at all?
Yeah, I must say the Western Cape's organic waste ban has really driven the required change. Even if you look at the sort of composting space, which is just one part of the sort of food waste system, the number of composters, biogas facilities, etc., that have popped up in the Western Cape over the last few years is noticeable. I must be honest, if my time at corporates, the Western Cape's waste cost was far higher than the rest of the country. So it has come with a business cost. However, it is really driving the required change, and it does help with internal selling. Listed companies have to adhere to legislation, and we have seen meaningful change due to the Western Cape's organic waste ban. And I think the nice thing is it's been a catalyst for business developments around organic waste in the Western Cape, and the Western Cape is leading the rest of the country significantly.
Now, if we contrast this position with the European Union, the EU has moved to binding food waste reduction targets for 2030 under its revised Waste Framework Directive. A 10% reduction in processing and manufacturing, and a 30% per capita reduction jointly across retail, restaurants, food services, and households measured against the 2021-2023 baseline. These targets are supported by donation facilitation, essentially requiring operators to enable safe donation of unsold food. Colin, when clients benchmark South Africa against the EU, what stands out most?
So I think the EU often provides a great starting point for South Africa. It's essentially a best practice. And as Steph mentioned, it does move companies to focus on these aspects and try and implement it themselves. So it is effective. But what we often see in implementing legislation that isn't designed for our local condition is that legislation has quite a few issues. And then I end up writing countless legal opinions about it. So it's great for business. But we really have to focus on our infrastructure and our demographics. And like Steph has just mentioned, that there's 40% that is not really included in these initiatives. So looking towards our local conditions and implementation in things like rural areas is really important. So I think benchmarking is not always the right term. It's more being guided by, but then changing the legislation and what we're looking to in order to make it specific to our context. And that will result in more success, especially for something like reduction in food waste.
And if South Africa were to close that gap, what would be the top 2 or 3 priorities?
So I think starting with retailers is the easiest, and it's great to hear and know that they're already implementing quite a lot of measures and systems to get ahead. And so that's normally your starting point, especially because our retailers also have an impact and an influence on customers. So that is helpful because often it's getting the information and sharing awareness with consumers and customers that really is important. And then from the voluntary agreement itself, that has already provided a starting point. Continued data collection on the current food waste is really necessary to inform the pain points and the areas of regulation that we need to focus on. So again, it just goes back to the fact that we need a local context, and to understand our local context, it's often driven by just understanding our needs, and we get that a lot from information that we can collect. So I think the other thing that we can maybe use to close the gap, and has already been mentioned, is just working closely with small businesses who can provide solutions for bigger companies. And there's a great opportunity there. And I think South Africans are really inventive when it comes to solving problems. So I think it's a great opportunity to work a lot more with small businesses and create companies that can really make an impact.
In terms of the local context for donation, the South African Bureau of Standards has completed a food donation and redistribution best practice standard that's expected to go out for public comment, and the Department of Health is considering updates to labeling guidelines, particularly around where the best before products can be donated. What we don't yet have is comprehensive codified liability protections or tax incentives that clearly enable donation at scale. Stefan, what are you seeing as the biggest blockers to turning surplus into safe, edible food at volume, and what would unlock this potential the fastest?
I think two things I'd just like to comment on, following Europe's lead, and then I'll get into that. I think the first thing is the sort of geography. At the end of the day, waste and surplus redistribution, et cetera, is a logistics play. And in the South African context, the waste cost is directly proportional to logistics, right? So you often have in urban centers, you have good solutions for organic waste diversion, for donations, et cetera. But as soon as you get out of the urban areas, it becomes very difficult and very expensive. So that's the first thing I'd like to note. And the second thing is the distribution of waste in the value chain differs in South Africa. So in Europe, you'll have a higher proportion of waste at a household level. Both Europe and South Africa are quite closely aligned in terms of waste at retail. It sits at around 10%, but the majority of food waste in the waste value chain sits at the production and farm level. So whilst our solution sits at the retail level for now, the biggest problem is at the production and farm level. And that's quite similar across Europe and South Africa. I think the big issue around donations that I have found is, yes, there is a bit of a tax incentive, but there's no real commercial incentive for the retailer other than a little bit of a drop in waste management cost to redistribute. Everyone, we live in a capitalist society and money talks, right? So I don't think we've yet got scalable solutions which directly benefit the bottom line for retailers. And donations certainly don't, other than a bit of a tax break. So I think for me, it comes down to commercials. For me, we haven't yet developed a system where retailers can actually earn something meaningful from their surplus. In Europe, there's a tonnage price for organic waste for biogas facilities, but it's tiny. With what we're trying to build a commercial system which incentivizes the right behavior at retail and which benefits the everyday South African. And I think retailers earning 50% to 40% back on retail value for the surplus goods is how we'll really drive that behavior. And it's also how we'll maintain food safety standards, because oftentimes, seen it at a store level, donations are put out for the charities to come pick up. There's a delay, there's traffic, it's hot in summer, and the goods are sitting in the sun, perishable goods in the sun for 2-3 hours, and then it's no longer safe for human consumption. So yeah, there's a couple of issues around with the donation system. It is really, really great and really does benefit the most vulnerable members of our society. But I think it's also important to note that the middle class in South Africa is the most squeezed population group over the past 10 years. And they really are struggling to put food on the table. And I think offering a commercial model where something is paid for that food, it really helps middle income South Africans. So yeah, I think it's again, I go back to it's the incentives, it's commercial models. That's where I think we should focus, because that's business, and that's what scales faster, in my opinion, faster than policy. And yeah.
It seems as if there's still a lot more work that needs to go into how we facilitate the donations. Colin, what should a retailer or manufacturer do now to future-proof for donation before the law catches up? Are there governance or quality assurance moves that make sense immediately?
Yes, so to Steph's point as well, I think if you're a retailer or manufacturer looking to get compliance ready, looking at donation more as a quality and compliance program, initiative, or step is far better than just an ad hoc last step. So really planning for it and implementing it into an existing system. And the new food donation and redistribution best practice standard provides quite a good benchmark to build on internal systems, so that when it becomes legislation, then at least there is a baseline for compliance. And looking towards governance, that's always a great place to start. And nominating a surplus food manager, setting up a simple food waste and loss policy that prioritizes prevention, then maybe donation, then feed and treatment is a great way to look at it. And those can all be put into governance structures to ensure that it's there within the company policy. And other things that can be included are things like rules and responsibilities for who is operating those standards and procedures across stores and distribution centers. And operators should start recording data and monitoring their food waste and loss, and planning for separation and donation streams. But I think getting again to the 40% independent retailers that Steph has mentioned, I think the key is looking towards how that would be done in an easier way, because they might not have governance structures, existing governance structures, because they're not reporting in a big retail setting. So I think even using things like the governance guidance and using the benchmark that's provided in the food donation and redistribution best practice standard is a starting point for many of those independent retailers. But I think it's also, again, awareness, like bringing those needs to their attention.
One of the ways we can avoid fragmented data from various parties is harmonized measurement. The EU has a common methodology. South Africa's voluntary agreement has a web-based reporting system and hotspot mapping, but national data is still fragmented. The draft strategy does envisage a research center, national planning, and more consistent baselines. But Colin, if you had to prioritize, where should companies focus? Is it scope, definition, hotspot identification, or value chain collaboration?
I think this really depends on each company, and they'll all have a different basis that they're starting from. So you'd really have to look specifically at their case. But depending on what the existing systems are, I think something that's really important is value chain collaboration. So some hand-holding will definitely be required, especially for smaller businesses within the value chain that don't have capacity to really implement a lot of these measures. So it's for bigger companies to take a lead and guide the less okay, I'm going to do my first edit. Veronica, please will you pause? I'm going to start again. Okay, this really depends on each company, and I think based on existing systems that they have in place. So you have to look at each company on a case-by-case basis, and it's important to look at value chain collaboration. So that's where I would almost start, or make sure that some good steps are being taken in that regard. I think bigger companies will have to do a lot of hand holding, because the companies that they associate with in the value chain, and I'm sure Steph can even comment on this, they're less sophisticated and they might be quite overwhelmed by a lot of the requirements that are necessary. So I would definitely pick value chain collaboration as a priority.
And Stefan,
Yeah, I think if I could just come in there, I think it
Sure.
also it's directly proportional to where a company sits in the food value chain. The further up on the value chain company is, like a retailer being sort of the last real node, their value chain collaboration becomes very important, because you need supplier data, et cetera, all the way down to the farm level, where that farmer has the hard data on their yield for the year, their waste. So there's hard measurement. So it does, the priorities do change as we shift up the value chain. And it's a nightmare getting data from suppliers at the end of the value chain, because they have other things to do, right? So yeah, it is data on the retail side is very difficult to get.
And Stephen, how do you see digital tools and supplier engagement transforming operations? Are there regional opportunities for shared infrastructure that can improve both measurement and outcomes?
Yeah, so the South African Food Loss or Waste Initiative, run by the CGCSA, does have a great central reporting platform, and they've had great collaboration and uptake from various players in the value chain. But again, it's for each node. There's a supplier before that you'll await data for to know your sort of broader food waste. So getting that data is very difficult, especially with teams with smaller teams. And as Carolyn said, there's a lot of smaller businesses who don't necessarily have that data. But I think the Food Loss and Waste Initiative is doing its best to try get a central repository for food waste across the value chain. And I think before that, all we really had was Suzanne Ulofs's CSIR study, which was great and created a great platform to kind of get a high level baseline on food waste hotspots across the value chain. But yeah, the work's being done. But any corporate sustainability professional will tell you getting that data is, it's a nightmare.
And if we widen the lens, the draft strategy doesn't just stop at prevention. It pushes for beneficiation, composting, animal feed, and biogas. It even contemplates carbon offset strategies to incentivize diversion from landfill. That's a practical bridge between climate objectives and waste management realities. Colin, when you advise on circular solutions, which models have the strongest business case today? Are we seeing credible returns in composting, biogas, or secondary markets for imperfect or ugly produce?
I can't speak to the strongest really, other than sort of comment more from my colleagues on the biogas. There have been quite a few projects, but more at existing landfills where they've tried to create biogas facilities. And even that has been, I think, fraught with quite a few issues. So it'll be interesting to see how food waste can specifically maybe make that solution a little bit easier, focusing on designing from the start for co-digestion and biogas. But I think that will be a while before we see that. And then from more difficulties, like in Gauteng, I know that our organic composting is still really difficult to achieve. And speaking to a colleague who is in that industry, it's still a problem trying to send food waste to composting facilities. It's often more expensive, and it speaks to logistics again and just the issues. So it's still more difficult and costly to send food waste to composting facilities than to your traditional disposal facilities. So I think looking for solutions, I think there are quite a few companies who will look at smart ways to deal with it, but I'm not sure we're there yet to implementing many of these circular solutions. I think we still have to get our baseline established properly, rather before we start looking towards, these are quite big projects that require a lot of investment.
For sure. And I think, to be honest, the business case for composting and biogas is yet to be established for the waste producer. It's still very often a gate fee, so businesses actually have to pay to dispose.
Yeah.
So there's a cost implication for business for biogas and composting, as well as landfill. Landfill's the cheapest, so it's often the one that's opted for. So in that sense, there's no business case yet in South Africa. I know in the EU, there's biogas facilities as well as composters who will sort of pay a per tonnage rate. It's small, but it is something. In South Africa, there are, the animal feed routes. There's also there are some registered off-takers where, again, there's a small marginal fee per ton. Donations would be the next best bet from a commercial perspective. There's a tax incentive there. But I think completely from a non-biased perspective, models such as ours, where retailers actually earn on that surplus, is by far the best business case. In addition to that, there's various in-store processes like in-store markdowns, reworking in stores, so using close to sell-by goods in the hot deli. Those have the highest margin return for retailers. So I think it cascades down to composting and biogas facilities actually not making business sense just yet, because there's a cost implication to the business. Whereas then you have donations, which is largely cost neutral with a small tax incentive. And then you have redistribution, commercial redistribution such as ours, and such as in-store markdowns, and such as reworking in store, that actually provide the best bang for the buck.
I see. And Stefan, are there specific supply chains, for example, fresh produce, dairy, or beverages, where circular interventions can scale quickly and cross borders?
Yes, 100%. It's just you're operating on a very short time frame, right? So those products are only really, they retailers. The job of a retailer is to sell at full price and is to maximize margin. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa just this week did plead to retailers to reduce their margin because of rising food costs. However, retailers are there to make money, and they want to stretch their margin. So where you can, and we're doing quite a lot of work now with suppliers, where instead of suppliers sort of doing returns, there's a potential opportunity for them to maybe move those goods through the retail environment as they approach their sell-by date. But yes, commercial models are the most scalable solution to sustainability issues. And I think it goes back to, I think we do bug down on policy, and policy does provide the guiding framework, but it doesn't scale as fast as commercial models. So how do we get this food to people? How do we get people to pay for this food at reduced rates, but we get it to people? We incentivize the retailer to do it because they're earning from it. And we are providing value to a stretched middle class who does need affordable food, because there's an affordability crisis in South Africa. But yes, I really do believe that commercial models, that it's very possible to unlock commercial models such as this. And we're seeing in the EU, businesses like Too Good To Go have done that very successfully. We see businesses like Aldi who have launched Wonky Veg, and M&S who've done Wonky Veg initiatives. So yeah, and those have the potential to scale, because on the one side you have the retailer that's earning, so they're going to put work into it. On the other side, you have the customer that's getting value, so they're going to purchase it, and it's not going to go to waste.
It definitely sounds like progress through the commercial models are more effective and can be achieved quicker. For South African businesses, the next 3 years are about deepening participation in the voluntary agreement, preparing internal systems for donation, updating labeling, and adapting operations where provincial landfill restrictions apply, if this has not already been done. In parallel, engaging constructively in the drafting process for the new regulations can help shape clearer rules and attract investment. Colin, if you were setting a 24-month plan for a national retailer, what are the top 5 milestones you'd lock in?
I think I would definitely start with governance and data collection systems. And again, depending on the company itself, and to Steph's point, it's so hard to get data or information out of some companies. Even just education around data collection. Maybe he has a better idea about how to make that easier. But governance structures and data collection is always a good place to start, if it's not already in place. And then flowing from that, you'd naturally move to procurement, to a change in how you procure your services. But again, there's always an issue of leaving some companies behind who just don't have the capacity to comply with collecting the information that you need. So it is quite a tricky balance. And I think that's a space where some consultation and partnership really comes in, to bring companies on board rather than forcing them to change. So more collaborative and working with partners to get everyone up to speed and on board with creating these solutions.
Steph, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is in the retail environment, and we are seeing with the advent of AI and auto replenishments and demand planning, we are seeing food waste drop. I think at the end of the day, retailers do, when one of us go into a store and we want apples or mint leaves, they want to ensure that there's apples and mint leaves, right? So having that on-shelf availability will always be something the retailer pursues, and I think technology is helping. I think sometimes it can cause a bigger problem. So I do think we're seeing a good a sort of a decrease in food waste from the advent of better ordering and better stock management. However, there's always going to be food waste in our system. And I think we just need to go back to that tiered system. If it can be eaten by a human, it should get to a human, whether through donations or purchases. If it can't be eaten by a human, it should be diverted from landfill, either through composting, biogas. But we need to acknowledge the cost implications of that. They are very costly, especially in a big geographic region like South Africa, where everything comes down to logistics. And yeah, landfills are a last resort and a no-go. It's a huge cost implication for business to divert organic waste that cannot be eaten by a human from landfill. But I do believe that there's no more excuse to not get edible food to human beings. There are enough solutions out there through donations, through commercial models like ours, to get that food to a human being. And I do believe within the context of South Africa, that should be where the focus lies.
That's an important point to drive the social aspect of it as we talk about the business case, and noting that industry-wide preparation for compliance and diversion has clearly started in one part, but there is the other part has not been included in this drive and progress towards reducing food waste and loss. Colin, what's the one reform or market development that would accelerate South Africa's progress towards 2030?
That's a hard question. Mainly, I feel like as an attorney that I need to say binding targets. But again, just as we've discussed, I think as soon as you force something, it doesn't always create solutions. It's more of a stick than a carrot approach. So I think working towards some type of incentives or focusing on the commercial models, just as Steph said, like rather getting the food to humans, and that way you solve a social issue and you can still be commercially viable. So I think just redirecting and focusing more on something like that is important, as much as my knee-jerk reaction should be having binding legislation.
And Stefan, what's your optimistic scenario for South Africa by 2030?
I think the nice thing about an environment like South Africa is we're a resource constrained environment, right? Yes, we do produce a lot of food. But if you look at the context of us versus an EU, for example, right, we we can't afford to waste. Whereas in sort of developed nations, there's less of a resource constraint because everyone has a little bit more. So I think South Africans are very resourceful. I think our economic climate can help drive our reduction even faster because we simply cannot afford to waste. So I think for me that I'm very optimistic about that. I do think retailers, their margins are tight. There's people that need food. And there's good business opportunity around this. I mean, for biogas facilities, if they can get consistent good stock, they can be very profitable. It's just about getting them that stock. It's about having the right separation at source. So yeah, I think for me, it's about the resourcefulness of South Africans as well as a resource constrained environment that could help us leapfrog.
Thank you both for such thoughtful insights. If there's a theme today, it's this. South Africa has a clear policy direction and an active voluntary framework. The EU shows us what binding, measured, donation-enabled regimes may look like. And the opportunity now is to translate intent into execution by turning that surplus into social value waste into resources, and data into decisions. Thank you all for listening and have a great day further.